Imagine being there, 1990. Nelson Mandela just released. He's at the UN podium, and there's just this wave of applause cheering. It's a huge moment.
Absolutely pivotal.
So today, we're doing a deep dive right into that specific time. What was he thinking? What was his strategy as, the path away from apartheid was just starting?
And we're focusing on one key source for this, excerpts from a PBS NewsHour interview transcript. The newsmaker interview he gave right then.
Exactly. Recorded at the Council on Foreign Relations. We're working just from what he said in that conversation.
Yeah.
Our mission is really to get inside his head at that critical point. Understand his strategy, his worries, his principles, using only what he shared there. It's a chance for you to get informed, fast, and deep about this snapshot in time.
Okay, so let's start with that UN scene you mentioned. Standing there, getting this massive reception, cheers, standing ovation.
Incredible. And according to the transcript, when they asked him about it, he saw it as a great compliment, but not just to him.
Right, specifically to the ANC and the struggle of the South African people.
Yeah, he felt it really showed how much their movement had impacted things globally, and especially at the UN.
But there was also that little note of, realism. He mentioned saying to the UN, look, thanks for the welcome, but it would have been better if I was here celebrating a victory.
Right. It underscores that the job wasn't done. Not even close.
Far from it.
And that connects to why he was traveling so much then, right after release. Why not stay home?
Well, his answer was pretty clear on that. He said, the struggle against racial oppression is worldwide. Simple as that.
And he saw the changes happening not just because of internal stuff, but also
international pressure. He said it was both. The internal mass struggle and that pressure from outside. So traveling was partly about thanking those supporters abroad. Essential work.
Which leads us straight into the whole tricky area of negotiations, opposition, and support.
There was this concern raised in the interview about a, quote, narrow window of opportunity because of extremists, on both sides opposing talks.
White extremists, but also some in the black community.
Right. But Mandela's response, he said they were not working within any time limits. Pushed back on that idea.
And the opposition factions, did they worry him?
He basically said that they expected it. These factions existed. And he added the government expected it too. Because in his words, they created this monster. The right-wing reaction wasn't a surprise.
Okay, so if negotiations are happening and there's opposition, what about the resources needed? That international support became crucial, right?
Absolutely. The interview touched on the ANC's financial needs, why they needed help from outside.
And his explanation was really practical, wasn't it? Not abstract at all.
Very down to earth. He listed things like, rehabilitating returning exiles and needed jobs, places to live, schools for their kids, real basic needs.
And then rebuilding the ANC itself. Banned for 30 years, remember?
Exactly. And mobilizing the whole country for peace. That takes resources.
And why couldn't they find those resources inside South Africa?
His point was stark. Resources were monopolized by the white minority. That was the reality of apartheid.
So given that,
it was, as he put it, but natural to ask the international community for help. A necessity.
Which brings us right to the heart of it, sanctions.
Yeah.
His big message at the UN and here too was
unwavering. He appealed to all countries not to relax sanctions, period.
The interviewer pushed him a bit, asking if he feared leaders like, say, Thatcher or President Bush might want to ease up.
His response was quite direct, actually. He said, look, if he feared someone like Thatcher would do that, he'd tell her directly.
Bush.
He said he had no such anxieties about Mr. Bush at that moment, but if they disagreed, he was ready to thresh the matter out, face it head on.
But here's the really interesting part for me. He also said he believed de Klerk was negotiating with integrity, that they shared the goal of a multiracial society.
Right. So the question becomes, if you trust the guy, why keep the pressure on so hard with sanctions?
Exactly.
And this is where his strategic thinking comes in. He explained there was still a possibility that relaxing sanctions could make de Klerk slow down.
Not because de Klerk would break his word, though.
No, he was careful about that. He explicitly stated his conviction in de Klerk's integrity. It was more about other pressures de Klerk faced. Internal politics.
So the sanctions weren't just punitive, they were kind of an obligation.
Precisely, that's the word he used. Sanctions put an obligation on everyone, implied both sides, to find a solution quickly.
Because the economy needed saving.
Yes, he pointed out both the ANC and the government were anxious about the economy. They wanted it on a sound basis. Fast.
So relaxing sanctions, even with de Klerk's good faith, could undermine the rate of change.
Exactly. It might give de Klerk political reasons or maybe excuses to go slower.
Right.
The sanctions kept the foot on the accelerator.
Now, this wasn't universally agreed upon, even within the black community, right? The interview brought up city press.
Yeah, a black newspaper in Johannesburg. They'd apparently supported lifting some sanctions. Their argument was, let's not inherit a completely wrecked economy.
An argument you heard a lot from sanctions opponents in the West, too. Did that view bother Mandela?
His response gives you a real insight into the ANC. He said, basically, we're a democratic movement. We tolerate opposing views.
So people could disagree.
Yes. He said people are entitled to their views. He acknowledged city press generally supported them, but if they disagreed on this, fine, they'd discuss it. He sounded really confident they had a powerful case on sanctions to convince anyone. No panic, just debate.
That tolerance is pretty striking on such a vital issue.
It is. Okay, shifting slightly, but still on the international angle. The idea of rewarding de Klerk for steps he'd already taken.
Which some Western leaders were apparently talking about.
And Mandela's reaction? Absolutely not. He said no reward is due. Flat out.
Why?
Because in his view, de Klerk was just undoing something that the white community should not have been done in the first place.
Yeah.
You don't get rewards for stopping doing the wrong thing.
Okay, but did he worry that saying no reward might weaken de Klerk, undermine the guy he needed to negotiate with?
His answer tied it directly to action. He said he wasn't worried if de Klerk carried out the ANC's recommendations.
And the number one recommendation was?
The vote. Extend the vote to every single South African. That was fundamental.
And the strategic thinking behind that was pretty powerful.
Oh, yeah. He argued if de Klerk did that within his term, maybe 4 years, it would fundamentally shift power.
How so?
It would take out the political power from a white minority and place it squarely in the hands of the masses.
And the result for the extremists?
The right wing would become absolutely powerless, and de Klerk, he'd actually be in an invincible position because he'd aligned himself with the majority.
But just to be clear, he wasn't saying black South Africans should vote for de Klerk the person, right?
No. He clarified that carefully. He said, I am not talking of voting for him as a person, but the cause for which he stands.
Which was?
A negotiated settlement based on a non-racial constitution. That cause, he believed, would win. And de Klerk would benefit hugely by being part of making it happen. It was about the principle, the outcome.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty, the actual mechanics of negotiating. What about immediate roadblocks like political prisoners, returning exiles?
He sounded pretty confident on those, said they could be cleared completely at their next meeting, framed them as solvable, practical issues.
And who would actually sit at the negotiating table? How would they be chosen?
His insistence here was clear. They must be democratically elected.
Not just appointed by the ANC.
No. He described setting up the structures as a joint affair between the ANC and the government. And he added other groups might be involved too. The ANC wasn't claiming to be the only voice.
But the key was the mandate from the people.
Absolutely. The interviewer used the American term Constitutional Congress. Mandela didn't bite on that specific label, but he hammered the core idea. Whoever writes the new constitution, which has to be acceptable to all population groups, needs a proper mandate.
And how do you get that mandate?
Through non-racial elections. That was non-negotiable. It would be the first truly democratic election across racial lines ever in South Africa.
Did he give any sense of timing? A timetable?
He seemed reluctant, yeah. No specific dates. But he did stress that their first meeting showed urgency on both sides. They'd already set up a joint working group on removing obstacles, and the next meeting was for specific decisions. Things were moving.
He also mentioned laws needing repeal, beyond just the state of emergency.
Right, a whole battery of laws, he called them, giving the government huge powers to suppress political activity. He knew it couldn't happen overnight, but he expected some to go in upcoming parliamentary sessions, a gradual chipping away at the legal structure of apartheid.
Okay, the final part of the transcript we looked at gets really fundamental. Defending the ANC's principles, their methods. He revisited that line from his UN speech.
The one about finding it strange that the victims of a crime against humanity were being told what procedures were proper to rid themselves of that crime. Powerful stuff.
How did he explain that stance?
His logic was direct. The oppressed don't choose their methods in a vacuum. The methods are determined by the oppressor. Well, he contrasted it. If you have a government that's peaceful, that talks, he argued, it's hard for the oppressed to justify violence. But under apartheid,
The reality was different.
totally different. He listed it out. The government banned organizations, banned activities, paralyzed people, intensified oppression, used brutal suppression.
So, given that reality,
He asked, "What do you expect us to do?" His conclusion, "We must resort to violence in order to defend ourselves." It was framed entirely as necessary self-defense against state terror.
and he seemed quite pointed towards the West on this.
Yes, he felt many in the West were blinded to this reality, that they lectured the ANC on methods without understanding the context.
He felt the ANC should be setting the terms.
Pretty much. He said they were responsible for the negotiating process now, so they should be the ones telling the world which methods could be abandoned and when, not the other way around.
And finally, that really tricky question about his praise for, figures like Castro, Gaddafi, Cuba, referencing an earlier interview about not changing principles.
Right. The interviewer asked basically, what principle were Americans asking him to change by questioning this praise?
And his answer went deep into history and loyalty.
Absolutely. He said, look, this isn't trivial. He recalled how the ANC first went to the U.S. for help back in the 60s.
Right.
Couldn't even get close to the government. They were refused assistance.
The Cuba.
He said, the moment we appealed for assistance, they were ready to do so, and they did so. Immediate help.
So asking him now to condemn Cuba felt
Unreasonable. That was his word. He drove the point home. Cuba helped when the West, with all its formidable resources, was actually supporting the South African government, their oppressor.
Wow. That context is crucial.
Totally. So expecting them to suddenly change our whole approach and condemn Cuba now, he said that's something no man of principles could ever do. Loyalty to those who helped in the darkest hour, especially when the powerful were on the other side.
Okay, wow. We have definitely pulled some really incredible insights just from that one 1990 interview transcript.
Yeah, what really strikes me is the clarity. The clarity of his strategic thinking, even in such a messy, complicated moment. And alongside that, just this unwavering grip on his principles.
Right. Even when they asked him tough questions about violence or alliances.
Mm-hmm.
And you hear him balancing things so carefully, like the urgency to negotiate, but also the absolute need for continued international pressure through sanctions.
And explaining the practical stuff, too, like why they needed money. It wasn't just politics. It was about helping people, rebuilding.
Exactly. And laying out that clear vision for how power had to shift democratically.
I'll say.
Through the vote.
And those defenses, for the armed struggle or for not condemning Cuba, they weren't just abstract arguments. They were rooted in the real hard history of their fight. Who helped, who didn't.
Yeah, it wasn't theory. It was lived experience, loyalty earned over decades.
So thinking about this specific moment, 1990, what part of his perspective really resonates with you now? Does digging into the details maybe shift how you see that whole transition period? Well, one thing that sticks with me is that point about trusting de Klerk's word, personally, but still needing sanctions to keep the pace of change going.
Right.
It raises this bigger question, doesn't it? For any really big negotiation, any fundamental shift, is trusting the other side's intentions ever really enough? Or do you always need those external pressures, those incentives, just to make sure things happen fast enough? Something to think about.